Thank you so much for coming tonight. We're looking forward to a good evening tonight again. I'd like to share just some books that are on the table. The first book I ever put together as a pastor is called Biblical Solutions to Personal Problems. What I did was I took different problems in the Bible, found 23 of them, and I outlined everything I found in the Bible. Like here's a chapter on depression, and I defined, for example, the causes of why people get depressed based on Scripture, examples of depression, characteristics of a person who will be depressed, consequences. There are 11 consequences of personal experience if they don't resolve their depression, and 7 ways Jesus or God in the Bible actually helped people that were depressed get free. Later in the week on Wednesday evening, we're going to be talking about depression, and we're going to be talking about how we could eradicate 90% of depression in the church if we just followed one principle to help people that struggled with that particular problem. Anyway, this particular book just outlines different problems like anger, alcohol, bitterness, different problems in the Bible. And all I did was wrote down what the Bible said. This comes with, you can buy it in a Bible study, so if you want to teach it in a Sunday school class or do it in a home devotional time, a lot of different ways, or home Bible study, people have used this. The second book is called Building Christian Character, which is the opposite of the other book. There are 114 character qualities that God desires in our life. They're listed in the index. On the third page here. There's a list of the 114. All I did was read through the Bible and identified every character quality God wants in our lives. Then I take a number of those, and actually 29 of those, and I actually outline everything God says about that in the Bible. Like here's a chapter on forgiveness. Here's a chapter on friendliness. Here's a chapter on humility. And I just define everything I find in the Bible on that. This also has a Bible study if you want to teach it. This is for the student. This is for the instructor. And all I did in these books is just outline everything I found in the Bible. Some people put this by their telephone. So somebody calls and says, I've been depressed all week. They tab depression. Right there's all the information about depression. And people think they know a lot. All they're doing is reading the book and identifying the issue. There's one more book I'd like to identify, and it's called Motivating with Scripture. As a pastor, I always had difficulty going into a home and sharing the gospel. We would be talking about world events in a home of a non-Christian couple, but I always had trouble asking them in the middle of our conversation, do you know Jesus Christ as your Savior? Have you ever trusted Him in His death on the cross? And I never could transition that. I was reading in John chapter 4 where Jesus made one statement to a woman in Samaria, and that one statement turned her whole life around. So I put together about 75 bait statements in this particular book. One of them is, when I'm sitting in a home and I see children in the home, I say to parents, if your children do 3 things, you'll be happy with them for the rest of their life. If they just do 3 things. They're found in Proverbs chapter 23. That creates curiosity in the people saying, I wonder what things my children have to do to make me happy with them. Another one is, if you do 7 things, I can guarantee you'll lose money. My brother did 2 out of the 7 and lost $250,000. A pastor in Colorado Springs did 1 of the 7 and lost $100,000. They're just bait statements, and there's about 75 of them in here. These actually were sermons I preached years ago when I was a pastor, and you're welcome to look at the book if you're interested. There are a lot of other materials. We'll identify a few of them each evening. I'd like for you to take your outline that you received, and if you didn't receive it, you can raise your hand, and because later on we'll be focusing in this first session on pressure patterns. One of the problems that I personally have found in working with people is there's a lot of problems that people have that they really don't understand. The problem of anorexia or bulimia, the problem of ADHD or attention deficit disorder. Those kinds of problems, people struggle knowing what is causing those issues. Through the years, because I test each of the couples coming into my office, and I started identifying what's causing these problems, I began to see a pattern developing. For example, if, let's say, a child can't focus in school to learn and is diagnosed ADHD, usually one or both parents is a perfectionist, dominant, angry, and feels rejected if the child doesn't do what they expect them to do. So whenever I see a child disassociating with ADHD, one or both parents have those four qualities, and they're pressuring the child in such a way that the child can't focus properly in school. About 1 out of 6 people coming into my office disassociates. And it's usually because of those 4 pain issues. Another problem that has come into my office is anorexia and bulimia. Anorexia and bulimia is caused by emotional pain inside of a child. Sometimes the child's very sensitive, high sympathetic, and if parents put high expectations, dominance, anger, and they reject the child if they don't do things right, those 4 pressures will create anorexia and bulimia. Now, there are 6 things, if parents do, will cause a child to run away. If you put high expectations on a child, you control a child, you're angry with the child, you feel rejected if the child doesn't do it your way, and you have pride, it's all about me as a parent, hypocrisy, I don't have a problem, you're the problem. Those 6 things create the pain that causes a child to run away. That's typically why spouses run away from each other, where all of a sudden a wife will leave a husband or a husband will leave a wife. There's usually those 6 issues in a person that is emotionally damaging the other person. We're going to talk about those kinds of pressures in what I call pressure patterns. Now, pressure patterns aren't necessarily sin. In other words, it's not a sin to be self-disciplined and a perfectionist. But that pressure on another person can easily damage them. So if you're a perfectionist at 98%, you can damage a person that's not a perfectionist with that pressure, and that's why I call them pressure patterns. Now, what we'd like to do this evening is, if you look at this particular chart, last night we talked about the left-hand column, where we talked about emotional damage, where a person is abandoned, neglected, ignored, insensitive, emotionally detached, rejects another person. We defined 5 out of the 12 we looked at last night. This evening we'd like to go across the top of that particular chart, where we're going to look at if a person is self-disciplined or has high expectations, how does that damage? If a person is dominant, how does that damage a person? If a person is expressive, how does that damage? Or if a person doesn't talk, or if a person is focused on themselves or angry or critical or judgmental, we're going to take those 7 and talk about those and identify how they damage another person. Let me begin by talking about high expectations. In Mennonite communities, probably 80 to 90% of all Mennonites are disciplined. That's because when I come into a community like this, I'll test everyone that wants counseling. And Mennonites are very disciplined people. That's why your homes are all painted, your yards are all perfect, you're disciplined, you work hard. In fact, Mission agencies love to go into a Mennonite community, especially a farm community, and if they can find a farm boy that's raised Mennonite, they can get 3 times more work out of them than any other missionary. That's why mission agencies come to Mennonite communities, because they're hardworking. Now, that's a positive thing. But there's a negative side to that I'd like to talk about, and that is if we're so disciplined but we don't know how to connect in relationship, that can create emotional damage. What's the definition of high expectation? It means to achieve, to apply oneself, to carry out, to expect. A number of years ago, I received a call from Nebraska. A bank president called me and says, "My daughter's dying. Would you talk to her?" We put her in one facility, and we spent $80,000, and she still wouldn't eat. She's eating 2 pieces of lettuce a day. That's all she eats. And the doctor has just told us that her body's dying. They put her in a Christian facility, and they tried to force her to eat, and she refused to eat. They finally had to put her in the hospital, and they put a tube down her stomach and forced her to eat, and she started gaining weight. After gaining about 5 pounds, she was sent home. Only as soon as they took the tube out, she stopped eating again. I had 2 days over Christmas that were free, so I allowed the couple and the daughter to come into my office. When they came into my office, I tested the daughter, I tested the father and the mother. The father was a perfectionist at 99%, dominant at 99%, angry at 99%, and felt rejected at 99%. Now, when you put those 4 things together, that emotionally damages a spouse, but it also damages the children. What had happened is his wife emotionally pulled away because of the pressure from those 4 areas that he was pressuring her, and she went off and taught school and emotionally didn't communicate with her husband for the next 20 years. The 14-year-old daughter, on the other hand, the father took that pressure and put her on her. And when she came into my office and I sat down with her with another lady in the office, I began to ask her what was happening inside. And she started crying. She says, "If only I died, my dad would finally be happy because I could never please him." What had happened is when you take dominance, high expectations, you take a perfectionist that has to control everything, and if you don't do it their way, they get angry, or they feel rejected and they get depressed because you don't do it. What happens is that puts a lot of pressure on a 14-year-old girl. And she had a belief system that if she only died, her dad would finally be happy, and that's why she was eating 2 pieces of lettuce. She wanted to take her life. Now, every anorexic girl or bulimic girl or guy, now guys are getting involved in that same pattern, are struggling with emotional pain. Now, if you force them to eat, what happens is you're not solving the problem. If you care about the emotional pain, they will eat within 24 hours. This particular gal came into my office with her father, and I saw the pattern. And I explained to the father the pain that he had caused his wife and his daughter, and he began to realize how he damaged them. Then I sent them in another room, brought the daughter into the office, and I started helping her resolve the pain by leading her into prayer, disconnecting what had happened from her father's damage to her heart. She obviously cried during that process, but we allowed Jesus to come and heal her heart from the pain. We took a break after a couple hours of working with her, and she opened the door to go for lunch, and her dad was standing at the door weeping. He said, "I didn't realize I damaged your heart. Will you forgive me?" And he burst into tears. For the first time, he realized he was the cause for his daughter's anorexia. A doctor's wife called me from the east. And she says, my daughter's dying. She's not eating. What do I do? I said, either you or your husband is a perfectionist, dominant, angry, or feels rejected if the child doesn't do it your way. She said, that's me. It's not my husband, it's me. I said, you have a choice. You can send your daughter to a facility in Arizona that costs $120,000 a month, and they will monitor and make sure she eats. Or you can actually take the pressure off of these 4 things, and your daughter will eat within 24 hours. She refused to deal with her issues, and they spent the $120,000. The bank president, the first illustration I gave you, the next morning, after spending 8 hours with the parents and the daughter, the next morning the daughter got up and says, Mommy, can we go eat breakfast? She hadn't eaten breakfast in 4 years. I never talked about anorexia. I never talked about you ought to eat. I never talked about pressuring her to eat. She's shaming her parents by not eating. I started caring about her pain inside of her heart, and she immediately started eating. What I'm finding is what the medical field is defining as problems out there are merely emotional pain that is being put on young people, adults, and that emotional pain is creating these problems. And they can be resolved if we identify the issues and the pressures and understand what they are and take that pressure off. You don't know how excited I am because over the last 30 years, every time I define a problem, I start praying, God, would you give me wisdom to know how to understand that problem and resolve it? Whether it's anorexia, bulimia, depression, whatever the issue is, because I want to help people get beyond those issues and come to freedom, because I believe God has the answer to each of those problems that people struggle with. But we have to understand what the issue is, what's caused that issue, and how to lead a person in a prayer to actually resolve that. Let me give you a third illustration. Probably one of the most dynamic pastors in Colorado Springs came into my office one day. And he says, John, I have 2 daughters that are suicidal, and I don't know why they're wanting to take their life. Can you help me with it? I said, sure. So the 2 daughters came in and they shared their story. They described the fact that they didn't want to live anymore, and both of them had attempted suicide on a couple occasions. And then I brought the parents in, and I observed something in the father on the test. The father was a perfectionist at 98%, was angry at 99%, was dominant at 99%, and felt rejected at 99%, same score that I defined earlier. And I went back and I says, can you tell me your story? He said, well, I was raised in a home where my father was an alcoholic. And when I was a freshman in high school, I hated my father because he wouldn't work, he wouldn't bring any money home. My mother didn't have any money. And he made a statement in his freshman year, I will not be like my father. He hated his father, and he refused to resolve his bitterness toward his father. And instead, he became a straight-A student in his freshman year, became the football quarterback for his high school 4 years, was the top student valedictorian in his class in his senior year, married the beauty queen of his senior year, went to Bible college, straight 4.0, went to seminary, straight 4.0, became a very intellectual man, became a pastor. There was only one problem. All of that was driven out of his pain inside of his heart. So when his wife, after they were married, got pregnant with their first daughter, because she wouldn't work out at the YMCA, and anybody that didn't discipline themselves like his father didn't, he had no time for them. So all the people in the church, if they were disciplined, he valued them if they were undisciplined. He had no place for them. So anyone that gained weight, he would have nothing to do with that individual because that was like his father. What happened is his wife got pregnant and he never touched her for 9 months, and so she felt rejected. They had 4 girls. 2 were like their dad, disciplined. 2 were like their mom, lazy, and couldn't keep their weight off. And as a result of that, as those little girls were growing up, he said to the 2 little girls that had extra weight, he says, if you're fat like your mom, no man will ever want you. Now, he had emotionally pulled away from them just like he had pulled away from his father because of his bitterness toward his father. And what happened was all the pain that he had experienced from his father, he turned toward those 2 little girls, and those were the 2 that were attempting suicide. It was his problem that caused these 2 little girls that emotional damage. Now, whenever you have a problem in a person's life, you're always going to want to ask, where did that come from? What happened? And then you want to ask a second question, how is that pain influencing other people? Because what happened is this pastor, even though he was disciplined and everybody thought he was the greatest pastor in the world, they didn't realize that that was all driven out of his own anger and bitterness toward his father. And so his drivenness came out of his own pain that had never been resolved. I led him just to forgive, like we shared last night, his father. And immediately everything switched inside and he started connecting with his wife for the first time in 25 years of marriage, and started connecting with his 2 daughters. And they lost their suicidal desires, all because their daddy cared about their heart. Now, let me just say this. Most of us as Christians get overwhelmed when we hear about suicide, when we hear about anorexia, bulimia, all these things that are happening. But they're not that complicated a problem. There's specific pressures that are put on a person that actually trip that pain. And if you understand what pain trips that, and you lead them in a prayer to disconnect that pain, they lose that pain inside their heart. And that's the process that we use at Caring for the Heart, is to identify, okay, what happened? How is a person damaged? What's the cause of that? And what we want to do is resolve that. Now, I'd like to go through the 7 pressure patterns, because these pressure patterns are all the issues that I'm going to describe that actually cause these problems in the cases I just described. What are the characteristics of a person who's self-disciplined? Everything has to be done right, and they focus their thoughts on what needs to be done. Often they make a list of things that need to be accomplished. They're frustrated if someone else isn't disciplined, and if someone doesn't do a job well enough, they redo it. Probably sounds familiar to most of us that are raised in Mennonite communities like I was raised in. There are 2 problems with expectations, though. A person can be damaged because other people put expectations on them, or they place expectations on themselves, and they never achieve their own expectations. The most difficult individual to resolve is a person who's had a parent put expectations on them, and now they're putting expectations on themselves, or to have 2 perfectionist parents, and the child feels like they're never doing it good enough, and so they reject themselves and get depressed because they can't do it perfect. When people have expectations that others have placed on them, they will either try and meet them and become driven, or they'll react to them and emotionally lock to others' expectations of them. And so what we want to do is ask the question, has a person emotionally been damaged by a perfectionist parent or perfectionist teacher in their past? If they put expectations on themselves, they feel guilty if they don't do things good enough, or they may get angry at themselves for not achieving a certain level. I've often seen people in my office where you have two perfectionist parents and you have a young person in college trying to make straight A's and they make one B and they can't accept that because they have to do it perfect. And often they have feelings of rejection if they don't do things well enough. What are the pain words that people feel inside when they've been damaged by expectations? They will make comments like, I can never measure up, pressure to perform, overwhelmed, inadequate, incompetent. Those are the kinds of issues that they feel inside. Now, let's just use an example. Let's say that you have a very disciplined mother. She was raised in a home with a disciplined mother, and so she's, let's say, 95% disciplined. Perfectionist, likes to have everything just right. But she marries an impulsive husband who's changeable. He's focused one day to get something accomplished. The next day he can't accomplish that, and he focuses on something else, and he's constantly changing. She's going to be frustrated with him. But let's say they have 4 children. One child is going to be like mother, disciplined. So mom's going to say to Julie, why don't you clean your room? And Julie immediately goes to her room and cleans it, and she's just as perfect as mom, and the room gets cleaned just great. But Jim comes along, that's the second one, and Jim is like his dad, impulsive, so the mother is going to straighten him out. His room is always a mess. Like someone described last week, the dirt just kind of rolls out of the room because everything's such a mess in there, and he hasn't cleaned his room for months, and the mother pressures him, and the more pressure she puts on him, the more he disassociates and mentally blocks that pressure because he can't deal with that pressure. I call that disassociation, where they can't focus. It's the same thing as ADHD. But the mother wants to make a perfect son, just like she has a perfect daughter, and she will pressure that son to try and get him to be as perfect as the daughter. And emotionally, that son will lose memory every time the mother pressures. In a family of 4, one will be like dad, one will be like mom, one will be the best of both, and one will be the worst of both. So you have 4 children. If you have 12 children, you have 4 sets of those, 4 options. You have to understand one of your children is going to be like your spouse, and one's going to be like you. And you want to understand each child separate. We had 4 children. They're all different. I have a son that's just like me. We have a son just like my wife. And the son that's like me struggles with depression. The son that's like my wife is lighthearted, but he can detach like my wife does. And then we have 2 daughters, and one's like her mother and one's like me. And, when I was younger, I tried to figure out what did I inherit from my parents, and then when you have your own children, all of a sudden you see what you pass down to the next generation. It's a little bit overwhelming sometimes when you think about that, because we pass down who we are. Okay, but what we want to do is we want to resolve those issues as much as possible. And so what I'm recommending is if you're a perfectionist, and 80% of Mennonites are, you want to be careful that you don't pressure someone who is struggling with that pressure, because if you pressure them without caring about their heart can be damaged by that. How do you resolve the issue of a person that's been damaged by high expectations? Let me just read a prayer that's in the workbook on page 116. If you have your workbook, you can follow along in the Caring for the Emotionally Damaged Heart. Jesus, my Father, had high expectations of me, causing me to feel rejected if I did not achieve what he expected. Jesus, what did that do to my heart? Can you heal my heart from the pain that I experienced? Jesus, can you make a safe place where I can go whenever I feel the pressure of others' expectations? Can you bring peace to my heart? Jesus, can I open my heart to trust my spouse? Here's some words to encourage a person who's been damaged. Let's say you have a husband who is damaged by a perfectionist parent. I don't want to ever pressure you to be frustrated again. I want to understand the pain your father and I have placed on you and care. What if I took the pressure off and cared instead of pressuring you with expectations? What if I accepted the fact that you can't achieve everything and help you take the pressure you have placed on yourself? Would you help me understand the pain you feel when others pressure you and you become frustrated and feel you will never measure up? I would love to have you feel loved and cared for rather than pressured. Just 6 weeks ago, we were in Hutchinson, Kansas, in a conservative Mennonite community, and a number of churches went together to host this conference. And a mother came to this evening when we were talking about pressure patterns, and she had a daughter that couldn't study in homeschool. And her mother all of a sudden realized that night that her expectations and pressure caused her daughter to disassociate, and he mentally couldn't focus. So the next morning she decided to do homeschool different. So she took her daughter in her arms, held her, and started caring about her heart and said to her, I've been wrong in pressuring you with your homeschool studies. Will you forgive me for that? I just want you to feel loved by Mom today when we do homeschool. I want to care about your heart. We received an email in our office. The mother said the daughter did 10 times more homeschool that day because she cared about her heart and she wasn't disassociating than she had done in the previous years of school. In other words, she was able to focus because her mother emotionally connected to care. Now, I want to just encourage you, all of us that are disciplined, and my score is 75% on the self-discipline score, and that's typical where most Mennonites are, so if that's where your score is, that's a good score. It's actually in a perfect place. But be careful that you don't pressure someone by not caring about them where they emotionally shut down. And if you have a spouse like that, you have a child like that, make sure that love is a priority, not pressure. Because if you love a child and that child feels loved by you, they can't disassociate and emotionally lock. There's a second pressure pattern, and that is dominance or control. Dominance means to rule over, to dictate, to have one's own way. The characteristic of a dominant person is they like to be in charge. They take charge of decisions. They like to exert pressure on others to do it their way. And they desire to dominate another person. How does a person react to being controlled? Obviously, if you're reacting, you can't stand being controlled, or you'll block other people who control you. Some people actually rebel and say, you're not going to tell me what to do. And some people disassociate or emotionally detach whenever someone tries to control them. Now, I enjoyed pastoral ministry. It was kind of fun. But one of the problems I had is I'm dominant at 30%. I'm a fairly submissive person. I had 4 brothers. They're all more dominant than I am. My father was more dominant than I. So I was the most submissive of 6 men in our home. And I had difficulty making decisions because they were always made for me. My father would make them or my brothers would make them, and I just kind of followed whatever happened. But in the pastoral ministry, I would be sitting around the table with 7 deacons or elders in a church that I was pastoring. And there was always one dominant man in that circle, maybe 95% dominant. And whenever I would ask a question, should we support this new missionary that came through last week and spoke at our church, that particular man, his name was Dave, he would say, John, we shouldn't support any more missionaries until we can support them 100%. And he said it in such a way, in a dominant statement, that no one else ever talked. So Dave made all the decisions in the church because of his dominance. I got frustrated with that as a pastor. So I decided we have to change something here. So I came to the next board meeting and I said, What I'd like to do is I want you to know that all 7 of you men are valued. Some of you are dominant, assertive. Some of you are submissive, passive. Some of you are expressive. Some of you are non-expressive. You can't share your feelings, but I value each of you men because you have been placed on this board to direct the direction this church is going. And this evening we have 25 things we're going to discuss that relate to the church. And I want all of your input. What happened is I started valuing all the men, and I asked them, what is your opinion, Jim? What is your opinion, Tim? What is your opinion, Dave? And then let's go together and take the wisdom that we have and let's go in the same direction together in unity. I have to do the same thing when I sit down with a couple in my office. I look at the test. A wife is 95% dominant. A husband is 2% dominant. The wife makes all the decisions in the home. Doesn't sound very biblical, does it? But some families are like that. Some homes are like that. And I say to the wife, ask your husband if he's had difficulty with you making all the decisions in the home, and all of a sudden have a husband crying. Because he would like to start making some decisions, but some husbands can't express themselves. They'd never been allowed to make decisions, and they just married a dominant wife, and she made all the decisions. Sometimes you have a dominant husband. He's never even asked his wife her opinion about anything. So he makes all the decisions. In my home, my father made all the decisions. My mother never made a decision in 39 years being married to my father. I remember the day my mother, you have to remember, was Mennonite, and my dad bought her a bright green car. Never even asked her the color she liked. The dealer just brought this bright green car, and my dad would like to Jew him down, and he Jewed him down, and he got the car. And I remember him coming in the house and saying to my mother, where are the keys for your car? I bought you a new car today. And so my mother went and got the keys from the back in her purse, handed them to Dad, and Dad handed her the new keys, and she had a new car. She wasn't even discussed. I remember the day my dad bought a 1958 Chevy truck, brand new. And us 5 boys knew he was buying a truck. Mom didn't know he was buying a truck. There was no discussion. That's the home I was raised in. Now, in counseling, I began to realize that dominant people can easily make all the decisions and not value a submissive person. And so I want to challenge you this evening. You might be a dominant wife. There's nothing wrong with submitting to your husband and saying, I want you to start making some of the decisions, and I want to value your feelings. You may be a dominant husband, and you might need to say to your wife tonight, I've damaged you. I've made all the decisions, and I haven't asked you your opinion about anything. And I think it's important to allow our children, as they grow up and mature, to start making some decisions on their own so they start becoming trusted in the responsibilities. So that's the area of dominance and control. And I'm going to say this, more people get damaged because other people control them, leading to rebellion. Only 10% of young people really are rebellious. Most young people rebel because there's too much pain happening with a perfectionist parent or a dominant parent. And when I sit down with a young person and say, okay, what's happening in your home? Normally that rebellious young person is struggling because they have experienced emotional pain from their parent. And 90% of the time it's caused by emotional pressure. 10% is the young person just saying, no one's going to tell me what to do. And if a young person runs away from home, it's almost always because of high expectations, dominance, anger, feeling rejected if you don't do it my way, pride and hypocrisy on the part of parents that emotionally damage a child's heart. By the way, no wife has ever left a husband that felt loved. No husband has ever left a wife that's felt loved. No child has ever run away from home that felt loved by their parents. You only run away from home because the pain is so intense that you can't cope with that pressure. Now, once I understood that, I started understanding what was happening inside of young people, because I have to deal, for example, with adults who ran away from home at 16. And I have to find out, why did they run away from home? What happened? And 90% of the time, you'll find pain in that person's background. I like Ephesians 5:21, submitting one to another out of reverence for Christ. That passage is just before husbands are the head of their homes, wives are to submit. It says, a husband and wife are to submit to one another out of respect for Christ. In other words, I need to value my wife. She needs to value me. It's not a matter of who's going to win, who's going to control. It's a matter of respecting and caring for the other person. The third pressure pattern is expressive. You say, what's wrong with being able to talk? I'll explain it in just a minute. Expressive means to be able to communicate, to express oneself. Expressiveness is not a weakness, it's a strength. But expressiveness can be damaging if we run over another person by talking and don't listen to what they're feeling in their personal life. A person that is struggling with being able to express themselves with a person who speaks nonstop will have statements like not listened to, not valued. Now, a number of years ago, a man came into my office, and every time his wife and his daughter talked at the table, he got angry. And I thought, that's strange. Why would a man get angry because his wife and daughter are talking? So I asked him his story, and when he told me his story, he says, my mom talked nonstop at the table, all 3 meals every day for 20 years. My father disassociated and checked out. He wasn't even there. He never had any discussion with my mom at any table. And I sat there quietly as a boy for 20 years. And he says, my mom just talked about anything and everything, and she never communicated. She was talking about herself. And he had an intense pain inside because of that. Then he gets married to an expressive girl. Now, remember I said 90% of the time we marry our worst parent? Well, he had an expressive mom, so he marries an expressive girlfriend. Well, the girlfriend, the first year, was fairly quiet because he didn't know how to talk. But as soon as their daughter was born, the daughter and the mother would talk nonstop at the table. And every time they talked, he got angry. Why? Because he had an issue with his mother talking at home that had never been resolved. As soon as that got resolved through prayer, he no longer was angry with his wife and was able to begin communicating with her. The opposite of expressive is not talked to. This is probably closer to our Mennonite culture because a lot of Mennonites don't talk very well. They don't speak. We're all quiet. Our expressiveness is probably like 20-30% on average in a Mennonite community. We can talk if we need to talk, but we're not expressive at 95%. But a person who is not able to communicate is unable to express their feelings, and they're unable to articulate their thoughts clearly to other people. There are 2 reasons why people can't talk. It's either inherited, one or both. If a child is 1 to 3 years of age and they're supposed to start talking, if the sister always talks for the brother will never learn to talk. So if Jimmy is 2 years of age, and he has a sister, 4. And Judy always answers for Jimmy. Mommy says, Jim, do you want a cookie? And Judy says, no, he doesn't want a cookie. He wants a piece of cake. If that happens in a child's life early, and I've had about 4 or 5 of those, that child will never learn to speak because someone else always talks for them. And you'd be surprised at how often that happens with an expressive older child, frustrated because the younger child trying to learn to talk can't get their words out fast enough, and the older one just talks for them. That's the number one. That's one reason why people stop talking. A person that's rejected and depressed often will stop talking. And depression is one of the major reasons why people stop talking and can't express themselves. People stop talking if someone's critical of them, or if someone has expectations or control of them, or if they're physically and emotionally or sexually abused. After the break, we're going to talk about sexual abuse. And often when a girl is sexually abused, she can go from straight A's in school, having lots of friends, to in one day after being sexually abused, not talking. And her grades go down to D's, all because of the pain she's experiencing inside from being abused. The last reason why people stop talking is a person is not understood, not focused on, not cared for, never given an opportunity to share. The fifth pressure pattern is a focus on self, focus on myself. It's interesting, I often ask the question, how much time do you focus on another person? How much time do you focus on yourself? Most people are self-focused. Self-focus means to be self-centered, wrapped up in oneself. It's interesting, a number of years ago, a man took the time to write a script for the film called The Titanic. And in the film, he describes, and I've never seen the film, I've just read statements about the film, but the film writer, when he studied and talked to the people that survived from that, are we dead? Expressing myself too much. The person that wrote the script for the Titanic showed the depiction of one man killing another man so he could get on the lifeboat, but that actually didn't happen. Actually, what happened when the Titanic went down, the men all got together and they just had a short time. They put their wives and children on the boats because they had the majority of their life to live, and only about 3 men survived the Titanic because they were all selfless. They cared about their wives and they cared about their children, so they hurry up and got all those on the lifeboats as they could, and they perished. When the author of the Titanic was asked, why did you depict men shooting themselves when that never happened, he says, in the 21st century, no one would ever listen to a film of a man being focused on his wife and children, because in this century, people just don't do that. What a sad commentary. What he's saying is, 100 years ago, when the Titanic went down, people were selfless. Now they're selfish, and people would never understand a film if it was produced like that. Nobody'd ever go see it. That's a sad commentary. And I want to say this, the majority of people coming into my office that are struggling with marital problems, the husband is focused on himself, the wife is focused on herself. They're not focused on understanding and caring about the other person. Parents are not focused on what's happening with my children. What are they struggling with? Talking to them, understanding them, caring about them. And that's why self-focus is such a damaging thing. A person who is self-focused only sees himself. He doesn't notice his spouse. He doesn't notice others. He thinks and considers only himself, and decisions are focused on himself. Self-focus affects our speech, our attitudes, our decisions, our priorities, our ministry, our relationships. There's 3 reasons why people can become self-focused. One is both parents were focused on themselves and they produce a child that's self-focused, inherited. Circumstances in life can cause a person to only consider themselves. Or if a person has too much pain and they're depressed, often they're self-focused on themselves. There are 2 types of self-focus. There's obvious pride, everything's about me. And there's hidden pride, a person that's depressed, focused on his pain. So you can have a very selfish person who's self-focused, or you can have a depressed person who only focuses on their pain. They can't focus on another person. Most depressed people cannot care about another person because they're so focused on their pain, they don't notice other people's issues inside. The last 2 pressure patterns are anger and criticism. Anger and criticism emotionally damages individuals because we're condemning the individual, we're attacking them and putting them down, causing emotional pain in their heart. What happens when a person is criticized is they feel rejected, they become angry, get depressed, become anxious, withdraw, stop talking, pull their heart away, and may even disassociate. I have a pain word sheet that I use in my office, and I have a person just check all the pain words they've felt. And often, probably more often than any other kind of pain, the word criticized, all my fault, failure, condemned, blamed are always words that are circled because people have been damaged through another person's criticism, causing them to emotionally lock up emotionally in their heart. Now, when you consider these 7 pressure patterns that you have in front of you, to have one of those pressure patterns demonstrated to you, to have a perfectionist mother, perfectionist father, is a pain by itself. But if you start putting these together, let's say that you had a perfectionist father, a dominant mother who is critical and angry, now you have 3 of these, that is emotionally going to damage a child. Or in a marriage, to have a husband who's a perfectionist and dominant and angry and critical is going to damage a wife. The case I just gave from Hutchinson, Kansas, the wife was a perfectionist, expressive and dominant, and emotionally she had a daughter. I don't know what issues because I didn't test the daughter, but the daughter was emotionally checking out, getting mentally fuzzy every time the mother pressured homeschool. And when the mother took the pressure off and started caring, the daughter immediately didn't have any trouble with her schoolwork. The daughter was actually ADHD, wasn't probably diagnosed, but that's the pressure that was coming. Now there's a verse in the Bible that I like. 1 Peter 4:8. Love covers a multitude of problems. Do you realize if you take the pressure off of your wife, if you've been pressuring her with anything, criticism or perfectionism, if you just take the pressure off and you love her, you can't hurt her. If you have a daughter that you're homeschooling or a son and that son is reacting, you start loving that child and that child will start learning. In my office, some people think we know what we're doing. 50% of what we do in our office is understanding and caring about people. I want them to feel loved. That's why we call it caring for the heart. Because when a person feels cared for, first of all, they're going to open up all their issues. Secondly, they're going to allow me into what their pain is that they're experiencing. And when I lead them to Jesus in a prayer to disconnect that problem, that pain inside, what happens is they lose that pain inside and they can start responding emotionally to the issues that they have in life. These pressure patterns, this list came from about 6 or 8 years of me just taking the time to write down how are people being damaged. And I just identified sometimes people are damaged by high expectations, sometimes a dominant parent or a dominant spouse, sometimes by an expressive spouse, sometimes by criticism, sometimes by a parent that doesn't talk. All of these things emotionally can damage a person. No one has all of these, but I'd like to just ask you a practical question. The first question is, have I been damaged in any way by individuals with any of these qualities? A dad or a mom, a spouse, a brother, sister? The second question I'd like to ask is, have I come to freedom from that emotional pain, or am I still angry when people tell me what to do? Am I reacting emotionally? If not, if it's not resolved, then I would encourage you to pray. And in this book, Caring for the Emotionally Damaged Heart, there are 40 prayers with each of the pain issues that people experience. And those prayers are right here with the praying hands for each of the areas. There's a prayer to pray to resolve that issue so you don't have to carry it. But the next question I'd like to ask is, have I damaged someone else through one of these pressure patterns? A spouse, a child. The exciting thing for me is to watch a father go to his daughter and say, I was wrong in being a perfectionist, a dominant, angry person that felt rejected because you didn't do it my way. To see a father apologize to 2 daughters that attempted suicide and say, it was my fault, you did that, because I never accepted you, I never cared for you. It's not about your weight. It's about accepting you and caring about your heart. And to watch those daughters emotionally turn around to, for the first time, trust their daddy with their hearts. That excites me. So I'd like to just encourage you this evening, if you've struggled with anything personally, I want you to come to freedom, and you can do that through prayer. If, on the other hand, you need help, that's why we're here. We have a staff that's here to pray with you. If you're struggling with anything, we'd be glad to help you with that. On the other hand, if you've damaged someone else, maybe you're a dominant husband who's never asked your wife any questions about anything, ask her if that bothers her tonight, and ask her if she'll forgive you, and say, from now on, I'm not making decisions independent of you. I'm only going to make decisions after I hear what you have to say, because I value you as my wife. What happens when you start caring and you resolve these issues is relationships come together, and people that are valued and loved start growing emotionally and spiritually, and we can turn around these problems to experience freedom. Thank you very much. I'll ask Pastor to come, and then we'll have a break after he comes and go into our second session, which we're going to have a testimony, and we're going to talk about different types of abuse and how that damages a person. So, Pastor.
3 years ago, John and Caring for the Heart team came to our hometown, and we had John speak on Sunday morning, and before the session started that night. And I was sitting there listening to John and his soft-spokenness, and he was talking about one of his sessions, and he was talking about turn to the gentleman, and he said, turn to your wife and just have her show you the heart of a young girl that was damaged and hurt. And then he said, I want you, when he turned to the girl, and he said, I want you to pray and have Jesus draw a picture of your heart and to show you a picture of your heart. Well, I was sitting there and I turned to my wife and I said, what planet is this dude from? Jesus is just going to draw a picture of the heart, and visually she's going to see that. And I'm like, it's going to be a long session. So anyway, we go to the session that night on Sunday night, and John spoke, and we went through the book and everything. And so we take it home, and the next morning my wife and I were doing our study. And she gets up every morning at 5:30, and she goes out and has her Bible study. Well, I was in my room, and I was doing the workbook and the sheets, and I was filling out all the words of an emotional heart, the damaged heart. And I prayed, I said, Jesus, show me the heart of an 8-year-old boy who was damaged and hurt. And he did. And I ran out of the room, I opened the door, well, I'm crying, and I told my wife, I said, I just saw the picture of my heart. And I look, and she's sitting there, and she's crying. And Jesus had revealed to her as well the picture of her heart. Well, the picture of my heart was huge garbage bags, not with little ties on them, but huge ropes with big knots, with all the trash and the garbage that had accumulated in my life for many years. And as I started trying to figure out where all that had come from, I went back to my past. And I came from a family of 9 kids. My dad was married 3 times, and all 3 wives died. And the easiest thing for my dad to do was to release us to somebody else to take care of us. It was hard for him. So we were all separated. And as an 8-year-old boy, I was sent to a family member on a little farm. And they had just started, and they were plowing with mules. We lived in a little 400 square foot house, no electricity, no running water, and with 3 other kids. So 5 kids shared one little bedroom. And I didn't realize the pressure this put on that family. But he taught us to work that farm. And I remember one day, he always taught us, never, when you're plowing, don't ever put the reins around your neck. And for some reason one day, as a 9-year-old kid, I forgot, and I put the reins around my neck. And so I'm plowing down through there, and I guess a bee stung the mule or whatever, and that thing took off and just dragged me through the field, wrapped me up in the reins and the plow and everything, and just tore me up. And so I'm laying there, and I'm expecting somebody to come and just nurture me and grab me and hug me, and that didn't happen. He pulled me out from under the plow and started to beat me with the hoe handle. And I'm like, what is this about? And so my brother was there with me. Well, he grabbed a hoe and hit him, literally knocked him out. And he said, I'm out of here. And last time I saw my brother for about 5 years, he was taken across the field. And boy, things just really started to change. And a short time later, another family member showed up and said, look, we've heard of some of the situations, we're taking you out of here. So I left and went with another family member, went off to Florida, which seemed like a long way away when you're raised in the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina. So anyway, I go down, and things were going pretty good. Things had changed. Life was a lot different for me. And I walked in one day in a bad situation in the family home there, and some immoral stuff going on. And I walked in. So that family member came, and they said, look, we can't have you here anymore. You got to go. So I left there. Went to another family member, and I was there for a while, and this guy was really good to me. He was as nice to me as anybody had ever been, and just loved on me as a little boy, taught me things that a man should really teach a little boy. And one day he comes in and he goes, you can't stay here anymore. I'm like, what? And he goes, you just can't stay here anymore. I don't want you anymore. So I left there. And 2 men came, picked me up, and they take me back to my dad. And I just couldn't understand, what have I done? Come to find out, he was dying of cancer, and he couldn't share that with me. The easiest thing for him to do was just let me go. So I went back to my dad, and Dad had just kind of taken on the lifestyle of himself. And he was indulging in women and stuff, and a 14-year-old kid really wasn't what he needed at the time. So I learned how to survive on the street, and also learned that love doesn't come real easy. And I remember one Christmas, Dad wasn't there. I hadn't seen him in about 3 days, and Christmas came. And I remember just wandering around the little town, and I would watch people as they would come to the homes and they'd start in the home. And I'd stand there and go, what is that like? What's it like to have a family? Somebody that really loves you, somebody to get together for the holidays. Man, what would that be like? So I started getting into drugs and alcohol and trying to numb that pain, trying to just find a solution for my own problems. Had nobody to guide me or to counsel me, nobody to tell me where to be or what to do. And so I got into some trouble situations. And again, the only yearning I ever had was for a family. And a few years went by and I met my wife. And she came out of a bad situation. Her mother died when she was 15. And so she'd gotten into some bad situations, also drugs and alcohol. So here we come together, and we're trying to pull a marriage together, and neither one of us had ever really been loved or knew how to love. So the situations wasn't good. And I remember she would try to be affectionate with me. And one of the things she would do, she'd like to caress my face. And I remember one night we were sitting there and she put her hand up to caress my face, and I pulled away and said, "Don't put your hand in my face." She's like, "What?" And I said, "Don't put your hand in my face." She said, "What's this all about?" And I said, "Just don't do it." So as time went along, she would do that again. And I remember another time I said, "Don't you ever put your hand in my face." And she said, "I don't understand." And it was hard for me to tell her what had been going on with me, but when during the interim time there of going from family to family, I ended up in a children's home. And the counselors there were teenage boys, older teenage boys, and I was there at age 9. And I remember awakening one night and had a hand over my mouth. And the guy said, "If you say anything, I'll kill you." And that's when the abuse started. So the guys would come in at night, pin me to the bed, and they'd take advantage. So to escape that, I learned if I stayed in trouble, they would lock me in my room, and nobody had the key but the house parents. So I learned to fight, and I learned to stay in a lot of trouble, and that became my forte, I guess. I stayed in a lot of trouble. But that was my protection. I closed up, shut everything out, and wouldn't let anybody in. So for years, that's what our marriage was like with my wife. Anytime she wanted to touch me, I'd pull away. Like, don't go there. And I couldn't ever open the door to my heart. Just like in that children's home, I took the key, locked that door, and I held on to it. And I held on to it very tight for years. And then John and these guys come along with the counseling, and I tell you, it just opened up a lot of freedom for me. I had not shared with anybody for 38 years that I'd been abused. Something men don't talk about. John shared about that a minute ago. There's not books out there for men who have been abused. You don't think of that. You don't think of a man as being abused. And so I locked up. My wife could never get in there. Nobody could get in. And what I hid behind was humor. I loved humor. So if I can make you laugh, you love me and you like me. So that's where I hid. And for many years, that's what I did. Everything was funny. Everything was a joke to me. And that way I didn't have to get down to the core issues of what was going on inside my heart. I had friends one time, they called me up and said, "Hey, we're having a party and we want you to come because you're the life of the party." Well, that went on a lot. And I told my wife, I said, for once, I'd love to be invited somewhere just for me. I don't want to be the life of the party. And she said, "But you've created that. You created that with all these people." So after I got through with John's conference, I had the Lord just take those bags and show me what I've been dealing with. And I did. I dealt with the rejection, I dealt with physical abuse, and I dealt with the sexual abuse. And I said, Lord, just take that. Take those bags, empty them, and he did. He emptied all those bags. And today I stand before you saying, I know y'all have heard John talk about the honeymoon, I'm sure. And today I can stand before you and tell you, well, she's not here, but we have a honeymoon that's been going on for 2 years now. That's unbelievable. And don't know if you guys have ever seen the movie Goonies, but Chunks, remember Chunks? They get kidnapped, and these robbers are holding Chunks. They got him tied up, and they said, all right, kid, spill your guts. Well, he did. He was like, well, when I was 8 years old, I pushed my sister down the steps of that. That's the way I am today. My wife just let me spill my guts. And I poured out to her all the hurt, all the abandonment, all the abuse that had ever happened to a young boy. And the love that we have now and our time of sharing is unbelievable. So I just want to encourage you, if you've come to this conference, and I know we all do, relationships are tough. And I just want to thank God today that we have John McGear and that type of counseling, because I've been through the other type of counseling, and a lot of anger came forward. And basically what I dealt with was anger, and it just kept coming up. I kept getting angry. They want to take you back to that time of your dad and your mom, but they never take you any farther. These guys deal with the heart. And once that heartstring is broken and you've released all that pain and hurt, the relationship you'll have with your spouse is unbelievable. So I just stand before you today as a testimony of what God's love can do, of how much he loves us. And at one time, I didn't understand that, because when I got into the drugs and alcohol and stuff, people would say, Jesus loves you. You just need to let him love you back. And I'd go back to a little 8-year-old boy, 9-year-old boy who was abused, and I'd say, how could a loving Jesus allow that to happen? But today I stand before you. If it hadn't happened, I wouldn't be here. And I wouldn't be able to help you with your heart. And testimonies are very important. So if John's messages have touched you in any way, I would just encourage you to open up your hearts. Allow other people to know your message and share with each other, because somebody out there has got the same thing going on that I've had. And Jesus will just take it to the feet of Jesus, give it to him at the cross, and he'll love on you like you've never been loved before. Thank you.
If you have the Caring for the Heart workbook, I'd like for you to turn to page 205. We're going to be talking about different types of abuse. When you listen to Donnie share his story, there were a number of different ways he was emotionally damaged. He was abandoned after his mother passed away and placed in numerous other homes where he was emotionally neglected and rejected. Then you have the physical abuse, the anger of this individual, and he was damaged by that anger. But he was also damaged at age 9 through sexual abuse. When you sit down and start talking to people about the emotional damage they've experienced, I'm shocked at how much pain people have experienced in their life. Because what we do in our office is we sit down and we ask for people to tell the story of their life, what's happened. And it's amazing how many people have been emotionally damaged in one way or other by someone's anger, criticism, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and this emotionally locks their heart. I wish I could say within the church these forms of abuse doesn't happen, but that's not true. In fact, 20% of men are sexually abused, 40% of women the nation over are abused. But when we go into Amish communities, the sexual abuse of women jumps to 80%. Because the sexual abuse in those cultures are even worse. We're going to talk tomorrow evening about moral failure, and I wish I could say the church is exempt from moral issues, but that's not true. In fact, moral issues are bigger within the church than outside the church. 98% of the people coming into my office have been involved premaritally. The national average is 90%, but only 2 out of 100 people that come into my office have not been involved sexually before marriage. Number of weeks ago, my wife had a friend who talked with her, and in Colorado Springs there's a 5-star hotel called the Broadmoor, and her friend had a friend whose job was to identify each time a DVD was rented out into a room. And whenever a Christian organization came to the Broadmoor to rent a number of rooms, the pornography tripled every time a Christian organization came to the Broadmoor. If just a secular group came, it went down 3 times. But it went up when Christian organizations came in and rented rooms. That's a sad commentary on Christianity in America, but that's the problem we have today. And I wish I could say it was different, but it's not different. That's a reality of what's happening in our culture. I'd like to talk about sexual abuse in this session because sexual abuse emotionally damages a lot of individuals. And in my office, I probably spend 40 cases every year dealing with men and women who've been sexually abused, and emotionally their whole life is turned upside down as a result of their sexual abuse. What is sexual abuse? Sexual abuse is a person is taken advantage of by another through lust, inappropriate touching, fondling, or sexual activity. There are 8 different ways sexual abuse occurs, and I'm going to define each of these areas. The first is when another person is lusting. Approximately 70% of men, it's probably closer to 90%, but I keep my percentages down, 70% of men struggle with lust and pornography. That means that within any given church, there are 77 out of 10 men that are focused on lusting after other women, and that sexually abuses women. Often women come to me and saying, I just can't deal with this particular individual. And when they think about it, that individual is focusing on lusting after them, and that emotionally damages other individuals. Often when my wife and I go into seminars, she comes out of a seminar session saying, there are 3 individuals in the particular church that we're in that were lusting. They're in pornography. For some reason, she's always right, because the individuals in one group of pastors, 50 pastors, she defined 3 pastors in that group. One committed adultery within 2 years. Another one was caught in pornography. And it's a huge problem today. Most men don't think that they're lusting after other individuals, and focusing sexually on them damages them, but emotionally it violates a girl when that is done. The second is touching inappropriately in sexual ways. And 85% of girls that give in to premarital sex don't want sex, but they're scared to death they're going to lose their guy if they don't give him sex, so they give him sex to keep the guy, but they really don't want sex. That's 85% of girls. The third way sexual abuse occurs is through sexual relationships, and we all know that individuals are raped, and that's sexual abuse. But the problem is broader than just rape, because a girl longs to be loved. And in our culture, Often, many girls are not loved by their fathers or mothers at home, and emotionally they crave that attention. But in our culture, they realize that the only way they can get attention is to give sex, to get a guy to date them, let alone to marry them. And as a result of that, that girl becomes damaged and emotionally shuts down. The fourth way sexual abuse occurs in our culture is one adult shows a child pornography. That damages a child for the rest of their life. I've had fathers introduce their sons to pornography. That's sexual abuse, where a son all of a sudden is exposed to pornographic pictures, causing them to emotionally become addicted to those pictures and later lead to a constant desire for that. The fifth way people are sexually abused is by parents exposing themselves to their children. I had a situation where a pastor's wife would walk from the bedroom to the bathroom unclothed, and emotionally the son, who was in high school, told his father, "Will you tell mom not to do that?" And the mother says, "I'll do what I please." What happened was, after he got married, he had no desire to look at his wife. He was repulsed by his wife and never could respond to his wife within the marriage because he had been sexually abused by his mother. I just had another case just a couple months ago similar to that, where a mother was aroused when her little boy, 6 years of age, looked at her with no clothes on, and that little boy never had a desire for his wife and eventually became a homosexual. And I had to deal with that homosexual desire in the part of the son when that actually occurred because of the mother's violation of the Leviticus passage, which tells parents not to expose themselves to their children. The sixth way sexual abuse occurs is when a person exposes themselves to another person, and often what happens is cousins expose themselves to each other, or brother and sister expose themselves to each other, and this emotionally damages and causes sexual abuse. The seventh sexual abuse area is practicing homosexual acts of sexuality before or during marriage. There's an epidemic in our culture of oral sex. And what occurs in oral sex is young people use oral sex instead of sex as a birth control. And 40% of girls ages 13 to 19 have been exposed to oral sex in our culture. That's a high percentage. But they don't call it sex. They just use it as playing together during their dating. But the problem is that emotionally damages a girl, it emotionally damages a guy, because what they're doing is what two men do sexually together, homosexually, in oral sex, and it violates the marriage covenant. Women hate oral sex, but often they give oral sex to men because men have observed pornography and they've seen oral sex and they're aroused by that, and they bring those homosexual acts into the marriage relationship or into the dating relationship, which emotionally damages. The final sexual abuse is reading books that are pornographic, that actually arouse and cause a person to begin to struggle with these areas. What does sexual abuse do to a person, whether it's a guy like Donnie in the film or a gal that's been sexually abused? First of all, their thoughts change about themselves. It's interesting, when a person is sexually abused, what happens is everything that's normal turns abnormal. It's like a motor turning backwards. What a girl should enjoy in a marriage relationship, she can't stand. So I am working with a marriage, and a girl was sexually abused, let's say at age 16. What happens is, what she should desire, she hates. What she hates, she should desire. Everything goes backwards when a person is sexually abused. Until You lead that person to understand what happened to them and lead them in a prayer for Jesus to heal the pain within their heart. The second thing that happens is their thoughts about sexuality become warped. And I hear statements in my office, I don't know why God designed sex as such a filthy thing, when in reality, the sexual experience within the marriage is the most beautiful thing that God ever designed, and yet a person twists that when they've been sexually abused. The third consequence is that often people become charged with anger and rage. The other night I shared the fact that when a person is sexually abused, 90% of the time they become dominant over 90%, become angry over 90%, and 95% will get divorced. Why? Because they're reacting out of the pain of their sexual abuse. Many become dominant to protect themselves from further abuse, and they will either hate sex or they will become promiscuous. 95% of prostitutes have been sexually abused, and their prostitution is merely acting out the pain that they've experienced. And that's a side commentary on our culture. Let me share the story of an Amish lady who had been married for 25 years. She and her husband came into my office, and we were working through the different things that she'd experienced in her past. And I asked her whether she had ever been damaged by bed courting, and she says yes. She says when she was 16, her mother told her that some boys would come into her bedroom, and that this was part of the process of dating and courting, and that they would stay through the night. They would have to leave before the sun came up, or it would be called a sin by the church, but it was acceptable by the church as long as nobody knew that they were involved physically. So from the age of 16 to the age of 21, she had 5 boys that came into her bedroom, Friday night, Saturday night, and Sunday night. The boys were only there because they wanted to have sex, so they would have sex with her, and she began to emotionally disassociate because it was so painful. Either the boys would be reading a book in the corner of the bedroom, or they would be having sex or arousing her, and she emotionally locked. When I asked her, I said, you've been married 25 years, and she had a number of children. I said, could you answer a question for me? If you emotionally were in so much pain because of being sexually abused every weekend for 5-6 years, have you disassociated in the physical relationship with your husband? And she said, every time we're involved physically in our marriage, I check out. I don't know what's happening. My mind gets fuzzy and I can't focus. What happened was because of the 5 years of basically being raped by 5 different Amish boys who thought it was okay to have sex with her, she'd emotionally checked out. So now in marriage for 25 years, she never enjoyed or experienced what God designed for her. So I asked her, would you like for me to help you resolve this? And she says, please help me out of this. So I led her in a prayer, which you'll hear at the end of this session. And she and her husband connected emotionally. He apologized to her for that. And emotionally, their relationship came back normal together because she came to freedom from that. It's interesting, the next year she asked, John, if I got a bunch of young people together, would you speak to them about bed courting? I said, sure. So she got 375 Amish young people together from New York to Iowa. They all came in bands. Some came in horse and buggies. So they packed out this gymnasium, and I had 7 hours to talk with them. And she says, I'll organize this if you talk about bed courting. I said, okay, you asked me, I'll talk. So here are all these single young people, 375, and in one corner were all the Amish bishops and the youth leaders in the Amish church. Make sure I didn't say something wrong. And I talked about bed courting, and I talked about how it damages a girl. And that lady was there, and she had organized the whole thing, got ladies to provide lunch for all these young people. In 20 minutes, had them all fed. I can't believe Amish people can do that, but Mennonites can do that too. They have a fantastic way of being able to organize meals, and it was a fun day. But I challenged young people, please value your purity. And we're going to talk about that Friday night. Because when a girl is damaged sexually or a guy's damaged sexually, you remember Donnie, he couldn't let his wife touch his cheek because every time she touched his cheek, it reminded him when he was 9 of someone putting their hand over his mouth so he wouldn't yell. And he emotionally locked every time his wife touched him. It was all tied to the sexual abuse. What happens is everything gets in reverse, and everything gets messed up when people are sexually abused. And I challenge young people that have been sexually abused, there's an answer to that abuse. You can come to freedom. And it only takes 6 to 9 hours in one of our offices for you to sit down with one of our counselors to say, here's what happened to me. Can you help me out of this? And we identify what happened. We don't have to go into detail. We want to know the emotional pain. And thirdly, we're going to lead you in a prayer for Jesus to heal and make that clean inside your heart. And only Jesus can change that. And I just want to challenge you tonight. There's healing for sexual abuse. You don't have to live with that the rest of your life and react emotionally inside. Donnie, the guy in the film, never went to a counselor. He thought I was crazy from another planet when I told him I wanted him to ask Jesus for a picture of his heart damaged. And when he saw all these big bags with these big knots, ropes tied on, he had basically pushed everything to the side, and he had a whole pile of all of his garbage he'd never dealt with. And when he and his wife began to share their pain, the issues from their past, and started caring about each other, and he asked Jesus to heal that, what happened is Jesus took it away, but he just didn't take it away. All of a sudden, he and his wife flipped on a honeymoon, and they couldn't pull their marriage apart. And they never saw a counselor. All they did was listen to a seminar like this and began to practice what we were talking about. Because anyone who picks up this prayer on sexual abuse in this book and has been sexually abused and decides, I'm going to be honest with God and ask God to draw me a picture of my heart damaged, like that Amish lady did. Jesus, how would you heal my heart? By the way, that Amish lady this last year brought in 100 Amish girls and counseled them, and the majority of those had been sexually abused. In 1 year, 100 girls came through her office. And she used to have a care and share where she brought Amish knickknacks in and sold them to buses that stopped by. She gave that business away, turned her office into a counseling office after she came for training, and now she's helping other girls that were sexually abused like she come to freedom. And I'm excited about that because lives are being changed because she's caring about those. What are the words that a person feels inside when they've been sexually abused? Words like confused, can't trust anyone, deceived, defenseless, destroyed, dirty, devalued, disgusting, embarrassed, exposed, forced, gross, guilty, hate myself, manipulated, molested, no way out, overwhelmed, pressured, ruined, scared, shamed, suffocated, trapped, trashed, unsafe, violated. These are terms that girls have written on sheets when I say, would you list the emotional pain that you've experienced as a girl being sexually abused? Here's a prayer that I encourage people to pray. And by the way, with sexual abuse or any abuse, you have to tweak the prayer to the person's issues. This particular prayer is designed for a specific person that had a specific type of sexual abuse. And you have to change the prayer, but the format remains the same. Jesus, my uncle, lusted, touched, and pressured me in inappropriate ways, causing me to feel violated, dirty, and repulsed. Jesus, what did that do to my heart? How did that change my thoughts about sexuality, about myself? How did that affect how I respond in my marriage? After each of those questions, we wait 2 minutes and let the Spirit of God prompt an answer to each of those questions. Jesus, could you make a safe place where I can go to feel safe? Can you heal my pain? Do you want me to forgive my uncle? What do you want me to do with the pain? And we wait and allow the Spirit of God to prompt an answer to that. Can you bring peace to my heart? Jesus, I've emotionally blocked my husband because of my past abuse. Could you break that barrier? How do you want me to respond to my husband? Can you make my heart clean from that? It's interesting, the average person, when you take them through a prayer like that, will lose 80% of their pain in one session. And then I have, if they're married, the spouse. If it's a boyfriend, I have the boyfriend begin caring about that emotional pain that they've experienced. What happens is they lose the problem. If you read books on sexual abuse, they basically say a person that's been sexually abused will always have the problem and you can never get rid of it, and it takes 8 years of counseling. That's not true if you use prayer as a method. If you just talk to a person, you'll never get them free from sexual abuse, because the more you talk about sexual abuse, the more the problem gets solidified in their heart and they lock against that. But if you ask a person, can you tell me what happened? Generally, and I don't go into detail because I'm a man and I don't want to violate another person, and they describe the fact that they were raped or sexually abused on a date or whatever the issue was, then I ask them and I give them a sheet, which is here, and I have them check off all their pain words that they felt as a result of the sexual abuse. And then I put a prayer together. Jesus, I was damaged by being sexually abused by this boyfriend, causing me to feel violated, humiliated, used. Jesus, what did that do to my heart? Can you draw a picture of my heart? How would you make my heart clean from that? Can you heal my heart from that? What happens is when Jesus heals that, the heart no longer locks and emotionally reacts to that pain. If a person doesn't get free from sexual abuse, often they disassociate anytime someone gets close to that pain. But when they watch a movie on sexual abuse or someone's talking about sexual abuse, they emotionally lock up inside. Some people disassociate every time anything of a sexual nature occurs, whether it's in a marriage or whatever, and emotionally they detach or get angry or control. And the key is to understand and to assist a person to actually resolve this issue. In this particular chapter, there's a chart in which you define each individual who has sexually abused you in the second column. In the first column, I have a list of the different ways people are sexually abused. Then in the third column, I have them put 4 to 6 words of emotional pain with each issue. Like, for example, if a person was fondled inappropriately, who did it? Uncle did it, cousin did it, brother did it, father did it. And then 4 to 6 words of emotional pain. At the bottom is a prayer that you can pray to actually disconnect it. Or you can take the prayer, that's the one I gave you earlier, which actually works better to identify that emotional pain. The steps to freedom, first of all, we have to understand how a person was damaged, understand the cause, and then lead them in a prayer to resolve that pain. With sexual abuse, often the person has a bitterness toward the person who damaged them, toward the perpetrator. Then they have to resolve their participation, because occasionally what happens is a parent says, I don't want you dating this person. They disobey their parents, participate in the dating relationship, and the person sexually abuses them. So they have to deal with their participation as well. Sometimes they have to forgive themselves, or they have to forgive God for allowing it to happen, because some people have blamed God for that particular thing that happened in their life. I wish I could say, as we conclude this study, that very few women are ever sexually abused, but the opposite is true. 40% of all the women sitting in this room have been sexually abused. And if you go more conservative in culture, it actually increases in number. Recently, we've had 2 or 3 counselors from Mexico that are part of the Mennonite Chihuahua area. And there are 120,000 Mennonites in that valley. And the people that are coming from that area to our counseling office, the percentage of sexual abuse is 80 to 90% of the women have been sexually abused, and 80 to 90% of the men are in bestiality, which means they're sexually involved with animals. And it's a huge problem down there. 80% of the men are alcoholics, and 80% of the women are depressed. And the individuals coming from Mexico are all excited because this method of counseling is working. And a gentleman just called me. He asked me for my PowerPoints, and he translated them into High German so that the Mennonites there would understand them. So I gave him permission to translate 40 hours of PowerPoints into High German. So he took these PowerPoints and just started talking. He said, the last pastors' conference, there were 50 pastors, and he counseled all night, because the people were hurting so bad with all this pain that they were carrying, and they didn't know there was an answer in the Lord Jesus Christ to that pain. And I just want to challenge you tonight. I don't know what you've experienced. If you've never experienced sexual abuse, I just want you to thank the Lord you've never gone through that. On the other hand, if you have been sexually abused and emotionally damaged in any way, I want you to be like Donnie, to realize Jesus wants to heal that. You don't have to go through the rest of your life blocking that pain and experiencing the lock inside as a result of that. I want you to experience the freedom that the Lord Jesus Christ has. And the solution is very simple. You can pray tonight at your bed, or if you want someone to help you, we have counselors here this week that can help you. Jesus, I was damaged by, and just describe to Jesus out loud what happened. Jesus, what did that do to my heart? How did that damage me? How did I respond to that? Jesus, could you heal my heart tonight? I don't want to carry that pain the rest of my life. Jesus, could you make my heart clean from that? The only thing you have to remember is, Jesus, would you draw a picture of my heart? Jesus, could you heal my heart from that? Can you make my heart clean from that? And can you bring peace to my heart from what I've experienced? My prayer is that every person damaged would come to freedom and would experience that freedom that the Lord Jesus Christ has, because I don't want that to damage your life and your future and the fulfillment God designed for you to experience. Thank you for listening me out. I know this is a difficult topic. It's not an easy topic. But if we can help you in any way, I would love to talk with you. Or if you want to meet with one of our lady counselors, they would be glad to pray with you to help you find the freedom that you desire. Let's close in prayer. As our heads are bowed and our eyes are closed, I'm just going to give you just a couple minutes just to share whatever issues you personally have in your own heart. If you've been physically abused, emotionally abused, abused through someone who's been angry at you, or sexually abused, I just would like to give you the opportunity just right here in this quiet of this hour to tell Jesus about it, to tell him what happened, to share your burden, whatever it is, and just be honest with him. And then just ask him, what did that do to my heart? How did that damage my heart? And then to ask Jesus, would you heal my heart? Can you make my heart clean from that? I don't want to carry that burden, that pain for the rest of my life. I want to be free. So whatever issue you've struggled with, we're just going to take 2 minutes here just in the quietness of this evening to allow you to pray through those issues. Father, I thank you that you care about each heart here, and you know each individual that shared issues of pain with you. And Father, I pray that you would in a special way minister to each heart to bring comfort, healing, and cleansing so that they could experience freedom from the pain that they've experienced. I pray that you would, even this evening, in the quietness of their bedroom, I pray that you would bring healing and comfort like you did to Donnie's heart from his sexual abuse, and that they would experience your love and your understanding of their pain. In Christ's name, amen.